your question, why is there suffering and where is God now, is somewhat different from the one that you asked originally. The earlier question was open to much more interpretation, and now, it seems to me at least, you're asking the moral question as to why God allows suffering. The change to the question is in the assumption that there is a God who could stop suffering, but allows it to continue nonetheless. Now, you say that God does not create suffering in any way, shape or form, and qualify that by adding that God creates and Satan corrupts. It's meant to suggest that because Satan is doing the corrupting, it somehow lets God off the hook. You talk about Satan trying to get God to do his dirty work in reference to Job verses 9 to 11, and you quote that God will not do evil. But God seems quite happy to allow Satan to do it. So surely rather than God doing Satan's dirty work, it's more accurate to say that it's Satan who's doing God's dirty work. Satan is just God's thug, so that the Almighty can keep its hands clean, or at least appear that way. And the premise behind the story of Job, this idea of God needing to prove something to Satan when God is all-knowing, doesn't make any sense. If God is all-knowing, then God will know whether or not Job is faithful because he is a godly man, or whether Job is faithful simply because he's blessed and is living a cushy life. And if God tells Satan that Job is good, then Satan has to either believe that God is telling the truth, and that this is in fact the case, or that God is purposefully lying. If Satan believes that God's telling the truth, then there is no need for the suffering inflicted upon Job. If Satan believes that God is lying, then there's still no need for the suffering visited upon Job, because if you're dealing with a supremely powerful being who can change the outcome of any test, then that test becomes meaningless. If you can't trust what God tells you, then you can't trust God not to interfere with the outcome of the test in order to maintain the lie. In any event, this second scenario is impossible because you quote the Bible as saying that God would never do wrong or pervert justice. So the whole thing boils down to two egos having a philosophical debate, and Job is just collateral damage, a plaything whose welfare means little or nothing next to their own satisfaction. This is a thing that's explored in a film called Dangerous Liaisons, where a good, innocent person is used in a cruel game simply to make a point. It's not something that reflects well on the protagonists. And make no mistake, the story of Job is not about Job, it's about Mr. Ego, God, and the picture it paints isn't flattering. The flaws in this story are an example of the doublethink mental gymnastics that believers in Christianity have to perform in order to reconcile what their religion tells them is true and what actually makes sense. You give another example immediately afterwards about sin being passed down, yet Ezekiel 18:20 says the opposite, even though we're all supposedly carrying Adam and Eve's original sin. You go on to say that children born of sinful parents are likely to sin, and so your God is punishing them for what they might do rather than what they've actually done. Is that really justice? If you argue that God is all-knowing and therefore knows that they will sin, then that excludes the possibility of free will. So these sinning children still aren't responsible for their predetermined actions. The whole premise is an inconsistent mess, and it doesn't bear up to any kind of rational evaluation. Although not being rational is, I suppose in an ironic kind of way at least, consistent with a belief system that refers, and I'm going to quote you here, to drawing out of demons, as if this was something that's real. And you talk about that in passing as if it's the most normal thing in the world to believe that demons are real. And I find that bizarre. I also challenge your argument that the stories told in the Bible must be put in context. This old chestnut is trotted out time and again as if it somehow explains everything. It doesn't. If taken in context in the books, these stories don't change in meaning one iota. The plagues on Egypt, as described, are a torment visited upon people who are not responsible for their rulers' actions. They're just more collateral damage. Your context as described, the Egyptians worshipping the wrong gods, doesn't make any sense in the context of a just God. most of the Egyptians would never have been exposed to the opportunity to learn about this one true God. So they're being punished because of circumstance rather than for anything they've actually done. And anyway, this idea of being in context when it applies to biblical interpretation actually seems to mean selective interpretation and cherry picking. And this is what allows Christians to condemn homosexuals but eat yummy roast pork on a Sunday. It's what allows them to deny gay people marriage but permit divorce. It's what allows them to gain forgiveness for harmful actions against other people by simply asking their God for forgiveness without ever having to apologise or return to the victim, and yet believe the death penalty is just. You seem to be suggesting that God allows suffering but isn't responsible for it, and I reject that argument completely, and I say that if your God is omnipotent, it is responsible for every bad thing that happens, even if it didn't cause that bad thing to happen. And to illustrate why, I'm going to ask you a question. John and Jane are married and have a 9-year-old daughter, Mary. John's brother, Joseph, lives with them and is sexually abusing Mary. At least once a day, he will perform a sadistic rape of Mary, inflicting both pain and degradation on her. John knows about this horrific abuse of his daughter, but does nothing to stop it. What do you think of John?